I know MicroSave, you've been in the agent network business consulting for a long time. I remember when we were doing a project in Indonesia, we sent people to your Helix Institute, which is another great resource for people to go to on agent networks. And I just wanted to get your perspective as we think about it and the research that you've done. You've worked in so many countries, whether it's Indonesia, India, Kenya, Uganda, thinking about all of those things. And this course is focused on the rural issue. So I wondered if you could speak to us a little bit about what you see as the current challenges for rural SECO networks.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And of course, it is the big question in many respects nowadays. I think that a lot of the urban areas have been well covered and saturated, but with rural, there are some important cost drivers for both providers and agents that make it difficult. So, I mean, the first is to identify, I put these into sort of three categories: startup, operations, and then revenues. And with startup, identifying the right potential agents is a real challenge. And many times, MicroSave or now MSC have worked with providers to build checklists to ensure that the right types of agents are identified. Then you need to onboard them, and that can be expensive. And again, we've seen people beginning to move to doing this on a remote basis over the internet and with Zoom and so on to reduce costs. Similarly, for identification, we're beginning to see people using geospatial mapping and alongside those checklists that we've prepared for. And then, of course, they need training, and training is difficult. I mean, when we look at the cost of onboarding and training agents, it really is quite substantial. And so, again, we're seeing people beginning to either charge for that training, which I think, reduces the value offered to the agents, or are looking at, again, at remote models to provide that training in order to drive down costs. Under operations, you've obviously got the liquidity, and you've got a huge range of models from, float delivery by runners who visit the agents to hand over float, all the way through to sort of inter-agent float management, where agents exchange float in order to ensure that they have the right electronic or cash balance. But the vast majority of rural agents have to trail into bank branches to rebalance. And that is a significant cost for them, and really undermines the business proposition. And indeed, worse, we often see that it means that agents don't have the float to make the transactions that their customers want and need, and then that reduces trust in those agents, and so they're used less, and so you get into a dangerous cycle. Also, under operations, you obviously got the monitoring requirements that drive costs, and then refresher training, particularly around fraud and so on, which also could be a significant cost driver for agents. And while fraud and robbery are perhaps more common in urban areas, they are not uncommon. And indeed, we see them growing significantly in rural areas. And that's why one of the most popular trainings in the Helix Institute, to which you referred earlier, nowadays is fraud and risk management for mobile money.
Wow, that's disturbing, right? Because we have to manage the liquidity, but you got to run the cash or get to the cash, and then if that's a point of risk, what does that mean? Both for agents being willing to become agents because of the risk to them, and then obviously to customer service. Interesting with technology, right? We've seen those platforms be developed to do the monitoring, the onboarding, and the training. I remember when we worked together, our firms in Liberia and Sierra Leone during Ebola, right? And we were giving them paper checklists because there
Yep.
wasn't the capacity. So do you feel like the providers are there with the technology, that those cost savings that can come from technology are happening, or are we just at the start of that curve? Is it going to be a while?
I think we are at the start of that curve. I mean, because a lot of our work is in India, and India is so
Mhm.
technologically advanced
Mhm.
nowadays, we are seeing it as almost standard. And
Wow.
I think that the COVID pandemic has really accelerated that move to, um, you know, internet-based onboarding, internet-based training, and indeed monitoring, because you can do a lot of monitoring just by looking at well-designed dashboards to look at, um, transaction patterns and so on. And indeed, you can even ask agents, if you're worried about branding, for example, at the site, you can ask agents to take and send date-stamped photographs. So
Mm.
there are a lot of ways that I think we can use technology to drive down these costs. But ultimately, at a more strategic level, I think providers should be looking at shared agent networks
Mm.
to
Mm.
allow them to begin to compete on product rather than just channel. There are a lot of issues with those, as we've seen in Uganda, but I think that is the way forward. And of course, interoperability between agents
Mhm.
will facilitate and speed that process up.
It's great to see those examples, and I think there's a lot of testing going on of how do we make more inclusive agent networks, and what does that mean, and how does it address gendered norms, and as you said, there might be a comfort level just overall with women as agents, regardless of the gender of the customer. Um,
Yeah.
Liquidity keeps coming up, and I remember in our work in Liberia and Sierra Leone, right, that was one of the biggest things, and it was hard to solve. And the mobile money operators, they're used to being telcos, right? They're not used to managing liquidity. The banks have liquidity, but they're used to having branches. So, what are some of the models you see around liquidity? And I know we talk about there's all these different constructs and it gets confusing. There's super agents, there's agent managers, some provide liquidity support. Can you talk about the outsourcing model for providers where they decide a piece of the agent network they're not going to do themselves, whether that's liquidity or recruitment? And how does that help? Because it obviously puts another player in there that wants to make money.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, as you said, there are variable definitions. So let's do a little bit of definition. First of all, from our perspective at MSC, we always use super agents as those that are used to facilitate liquidity rebalancing, whereas master agents do recruitment, onboarding, and liquidity management, as well as quite often monitoring of agents. So the whole lot is essentially outsourced, whereas super agents is really focused on the liquidity rebalancing. When people are setting up agent networks, we typically see a sort of graduation approach. So people
Mm.
start directly managing their own agents in order to learn the ropes and understand the nuances of managing a network of agents. Then they begin to recruit super agents to help with liquidity, um, and those super agents are, very often cash-rich retail outlets and so on. And then finally, once the whole typically mobile money network is taking off, then they start to recruit master agents and outsource more and more of that. We see banks typically prefer to use their branches as hubs and
Mm,
run
mm, mm.
networks of agents directly from those hubs. So I think that that's an important note to make, and I can understand that because for banks, uh, the 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 brand and reputation risk associated with agents, I think, is that much higher than it is with telcos. I'm sure that some telcos would disagree with me, but banks, banking is so much about trust that if you have if agents not performing to the standards that you require, that has significant implications. And so I think that's why banks prefer to use their branches as hubs to run the agent networks.
And because the rural areas are harder, I do personally believe that the government has to play a role, at least in the short term. And whether it's G2P payments and they're paying the transaction fees so the end user doesn't have to, and they're trying to push those volumes. But if that's once a month, that's not going to sustain an agent, right? Or they're giving incentives, or they're doing something that makes that agent model work. But I hear you saying maybe we won't use Kiko agent in the future. So if you want to forecast out as kind of our final question here, where do you think if we were to have this conversation in 5 years, do you think we'll still be saying Kiko agents, or do you think we'll just be talking about retail agents? And will they be in rural areas and active?
Gosh, there are a whole series of questions bundled up in that. First of all, I absolutely think we'll be talking about Kiko agents still. As I say, they may be part of that differentiated agent network that I talked about, so that the more sophisticated sales agents that are offering a wide range of digital services from 3G enabled outlets are one component of that differentiated network. And those in the 2G more remote rural areas may still just be doing cash in, cash out. I don't see the need for cash disappearing anytime soon. And furthermore, as you say, I mean, I think that the role of government will remain critical. Whether we'll ever see governments directly subsidizing rural agents, I'm inclined to doubt. I think that the way they will subsidize them is by pushing increasing numbers of payments to poorer, vulnerable, and thus typically more remote communities through these digital money systems, and thus through these remote agents. Now, even there's a problem, because I mean, we've in India we've seen, and again, India is dedicated to optimizing these systems, but the commission rates that are being paid on those G2P payments are fairly thin, should we say politely, and certainly for in the initial stages they were simply too low. The Nandan Nilekani 3.14% as a commission rate, and the government of India was offering between 0.5% and 1%.
Wow.
So while I think that governments will have to play a key lead role, I don't think that will get these agents to stand up on their own. And we will have to see, as we move people into more financial inclusion, and financial inclusion begins to dovetail to real economies, so that people are needing to make payments into agricultural value chains or for the kids' education or whatever it is, that they are more and more comfortable with doing that using digital payment systems. Now, we should take a step back here and say we are a long way away from that, realistically speaking. In many, many areas, I still see people struggling with the technology, struggling with literacy and numeracy. There's a very substantial oral segment that obviously struggle with traditional interfaces. And a lot of them simply just don't trust digital financial services or the whole digital world that is unfolding around them. And we have a lot of work. And if you wanted my sort of bet on where the key struggle will be in the future, it is actually around difficult to manage soft stuff like of
Mhm.
digital capability and trust.
Mhm.
You know, and that's why my earlier comments about fraud and robbery are so important, because while agents are very often, you know, facing fraud and robbery, so are their customers,
Mhm.
particularly you know, abroad, and it only takes one person in the village to have a bad experience, and then suddenly everyone starts worrying about whether they should be using this very intangible and difficult to understand digital financial services. Something reassuring about having notes in your hand. You know it's there, you know what it stands for, and everyone recognizes the value of that strangely printed piece of paper.
Yeah, indeed, we're running this, as you know, this Women's Digital Financial Literacy campaign, and it's a
Yeah,
series of audio lessons, and consistently in the top are how do I protect myself from scams is one of
yeah,
the top lessons because people are fearful of that. And we've even heard of people, you know, as you have, pushing messages, want the COVID vaccine, send money here. And so
yeah,
having that agent who's a human to go to talk to, who's someone you know in your community, I think is going to be continue to be valuable. But maybe we should think about compensating for that because I don't think we compensate agents for being trusted or literacy agents. They get paid if a transaction goes through. So thinking
yeah,
through what is that value of providing me a presence, and is there a way that the business model can shift to recognize some of those soft delivery, solving some of those soft skills in a way that's economically beneficial to the agent.